Welcome back to another edition of Components Breakdown. Today we're going to take a very special look at Fantasy Flight Games' newest 2 to 5 player adventure and exploration game called Mansions of Madness, which is also thematically based in the Arkham Horror universe. Mansions of Madness is a cooperative, competitive game in which one player will take on the role of the keeper of the mansion, while all the other players will take on the roles of the investigators. Each game takes place within one of the 5 pre-designed stories that provide its players with unique map layouts, as well as several combinations of plot threads to discover. These individual plot threads affect not only the monsters that the investigators may encounter, but also the clues that they will need to find, as well as which climatic story ending they will ultimately experience. The game essentially creates an immersive story that, given its players' decisions, can unravel in different and exciting ways. In fact, each of the game's 5 stories have 3 different possible objective cards attached to them, so players replaying the same stories may discover completely new sets of goals and winning conditions on each repeated playthrough. During the game, investigators come to explore a location in order to unravel an unknown mystery. Investigators win or lose as a team, and they will need to use their intelligence as well as their brute force as a group to find artifacts, weapons, and clues that can stop the Keeper's plot from occurring. The Keeper's goal is to complete his evil scheme by fulfilling the objectives of that story, using his weapons of fear, paranoia, as well as the many hordes of monsters that he can unleash upon the investigators. Now, there is only so much that I'm going to share with you about Mansions of Madness in this review, mostly because to explain and detail too many aspects of its gameplay would spoil the joy of experiencing the story for oneself. Therefore, I will break this review into 3 separate parts. Part 1, of which you are now watching, will strictly cover the game's many components in greater detail, while Part 2 will cover the game's basic gameplay as well as my final review. Part 3 will come at a later time and will be a surprise to those who are interested in this universe. Finally, for obvious reasons, as well as those I've already mentioned, I will not be covering the game's setup, which is done by using both the Investigator's Guide and the Keeper's Guide. Now, as is typical with most all of my video reviews, I find that visually illustrating the setup of a game is equally as important to understanding a game's functions as explaining the mechanics itself. So I apologize in advance for intentionally leaving this portion of the game out, but again, my intentions are not to reveal too many pieces of the game that could spoil players' first experiences. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at the components within Mansions of Madness. In order to best comprehend any game's mechanics, one must first understand the use of all of its components. Therefore, we will be spending the rest of our time in part 1 of this video looking at the many components within Mansions of Madness, and we'll start off with the most simplistic of its pieces, the 10-sided die. The provided die is used primarily for the many attribute tests that will occur within the game, with the result of the die rolls determining whether or not an investigator passes or fails any given task that is assigned to them. These tests always refer to one of the investigator's many attributes within the game, such as marksmanship, intelligence, or even willpower, which leads us to our first group set of components: the character cards and corresponding investigator figures, the trait cards, the starting item cards, and the skill point tokens. Each of the 8 investigators has a figure and card associated to that specific character, which lists their starting health, sanity, and skill points. Now, it should be noted that the molds that are used for the investigator miniatures are identical to the Arkham Horror pre-painted collector series figures from Fantasy Flight Games, so they are fully interchangeable within the 2 games. At the start of the game, and after picking their chosen investigator and miniature, each player will then choose 2 of the 4 available trait cards that are unique to his character. These trait cards list the investigator's possible starting equipment, their once per game abilities, and their base attributes that will be tested throughout the course of the game. In choosing the investigator's 2 trait cards, players will then need to gather the specified starting item cards that represent those items and/or allies that are unique to that character. The last component that is associated with this group are the skill point tokens. Each of the investigators starts the game with a specified number of skill point tokens as depicted on their investigator's character card. These tokens can be spent to modify an attribute test in the investigator's favor prior to the rolling of the 10-sided dice, but they should be used sparingly because they are rarely replenished within the game. The next set of components revolve around the functions of the mansion and its numerous features and include the map tiles, room feature markers, sealed door markers, status effect tokens, exploration cards, and spell cards, as well as the obstacles and locks. Let's start off by exploring the foundation of all of those mentioned components, the map tiles. The 15 provided map tiles come in 3 different sizes. There is 1 large tile, 7 medium tiles, and 7 small tiles, all of which are double-sided. The tiles are used to create the game board during the game's setup, and will change depending upon the story that was chosen by the players. A map tile can better be explained by looking at its 4 distinguishable markings. First, each tile's area represents at least 1 room within the mansion, but a tile may also contain multiple rooms within its area. Rooms are separated from other rooms on any given map tile by solid brown walls, doors, or the edges of a map tile itself, and are designated as a room by its printed name on that tile. Second, each tile contains spaces, which can be thought of as the smallest division of any given room, and are separated from other spaces by white lines, as well as solid brown walls and doors. Spaces represent the sections of movement that both investigators and monsters travel over through the course of the game. Third, each space contains white dots that are used in determining line of sight during ranged combat in the game. Figures have line of sight if the players can trace a line from at least 1 corner dot in their space to a corner dot in the target space without crossing a brown wall or a doorway. And fourth, map tiles contain doors through which investigators and monsters alike must access and move through in order to enter specific rooms or spaces within the mansion. Next, there are 18 room feature markers. During the game's setup, the investigator's guide may have the players place a number of these room feature markers in specific spaces on the game board. These markers have various gameplay effects and interact with the monsters and investigators in different ways. There are 7 different types of room feature markers, which can represent anything from furniture that can be temporarily used as a barrier to block doorways, to chests that can be used as hiding spaces so that investigators can attempt to avoid monster attacks altogether. Also included are sealed door markers, which represent doors that can be boarded up, bricked over, or otherwise made completely impassable for the entirety of the game to both the investigators and the monsters. Similar to room feature markers, sealed door markers are likewise placed on the game board during the setup as instructed by the story guide. Next are the 3 different status effect tokens, which are stun, fire, and darkness. These 3 tokens will be used at various moments of the game to mark the ongoing effects or status of a specific room, investigator, or monster. Each effect can have different repercussions depending upon which of the 2 factions are affected by the token. Likewise, different status effects are stackable, meaning that investigators can suffer the effects of 2 different status tokens simultaneously. Stun typically slows down the speed at which investigators may move through the mansion, as well as their ability to effectively test their attributes. Fire deals direct damage to figures that end their turn in that affected space, as well as generate horror points to those who ineffectively test their willpower when attempting to enter those affected spaces. And darkness makes both exploration and combat increasingly difficult in rooms that are infected by its status token. Moving on, we have the 83 exploration cards, which are arguably the most important feature and objective for the investigators to obtain. Exploration cards are specially seated and placed throughout the many rooms of the mansion during the game's setup by the keeper himself, and represent the items and important clues that can be found by the investigators. Exploration cards should always be of prime interest to the group as a whole, and although some may have no effect other than wasting the investigator's time and resources, many will lead to valuable sets of equipment, weapons, artifacts, tomes, and essential sets of keys to open certain locks throughout the mansion. The clues, however, are the cards that the investigators are ultimately attempting to reveal, and every effort should be made in discovering their locations in a timely manner in order to thwart the keeper's final objectives. One of the abilities players may earn for their investigators by searching rooms and their contained exploration cards are spells, which are contained within the many tomes seated around the mansion. Players do not inherently begin the game with spells, so finding them could be essential to utilizing all of a character's best attributes. The 20 included spells come in only 4 different types. However, each type has 5 different variations, with different backs and outcomes for each of those spells. The inclusion of this type of system within the game most definitely creates another random element that can't easily be predicted. Essentially, a player may cast Bind Monster and have one outcome on a pass or fail result, and have a completely different outcome with another one of the 5 Bind Monster spells. The last 2 sets of components in this category are the obstacles and locks. While exploring the mansion, investigators will sometimes reveal obstacles, which represent some obstruction or challenge preventing a player from exploring that room. These sets of cards often require the investigator to perform a task before revealing the cards beneath it. Obstacle cards sometimes require the investigator to solve a puzzle or use a particular key in their possession in order to discard that particular obstacle, which brings me to one of the most often talked about and misunderstood portions of the game, the locks and puzzles. Occasionally a player will encounter an exploration card that requires them to solve a puzzle or lock within the mansion. Puzzles in general exist within the game to slow down the investigator's progress and allow the keeper additional time to muster his forces upon them. By completing a puzzle, the players can effectively proceed with their movement and exploration of the mansion's grounds to further their investigations. Now, there are 3 types of puzzles in the game. There's wiring puzzles, locks, and runes. And though each of these will have a different objective to fulfill, each investigator will perform the same exact basic puzzle actions when attempting to complete them. Puzzles essentially work like this. Whenever an investigator encounters a puzzle for the very first time, the player will need to resolve the following steps in order, and we will use a wiring puzzle as an example for this explanation. Before we get started though, to complete a wiring puzzle, a player must be able to trace a continuous path of red and blue matching wires from the puzzle's start to the puzzle's end locations. First, he will place the appropriate puzzle setup card that he encountered from the exploration deck face up in front of him, along with the initial puzzle piece that is shown on that card. Second, he will shuffle the appropriate pile of unused puzzle pieces face down, randomizing them in front of him. Third, the player will draw puzzle pieces from that pile and place them one at a time in rows according to the diagram shown on the card that is calling for that specific puzzle. Pieces will be placed with their arrows pointing towards the top of the puzzle. Now, the active player is now ready at this point to solve the puzzle at hand, and to do so, a player will be given a set number of puzzle actions that are equal to the investigator's intellect, which is found on their trait card. Puzzle actions allow a player to do one of the 3 different combinations of actions, each costing 1 puzzle action to perform. First, they may swap 2 adjacent puzzle pieces with each other. However, they are not allowed to rotate either of the 2 pieces that are being swapped and must keep them in their original orientation. Second, they may rotate any single piece 90 degrees in either clockwise or counterclockwise direction. And third, they may draw a new puzzle piece from the unused pile and replace it with an existing piece. However, they must place the new puzzle piece in its starting orientation, which is face up or towards the top of the puzzle. Players are not allowed to assist the active investigator in their attempt, so it truly becomes a test of one's own personal problem-solving skills that will make them effective at this portion of the game. Now, what is unique about this system, though, is that if a particular investigator is unable to complete a puzzle or lock due to having spent all of their puzzle actions, the partially completed puzzle will remain on the table in its current configuration until that player wishes to continue their endeavors on a future turn, or another player wishes to pick up where they left off. The last set of components deal almost exclusively with the keeper and his numerous actions that he will partake through the course of the game. And there's a lot to cover, so we will be brief in most of their explanations. We'll start off with the Keeper Guide, which is a separate book that contains the information required for the keeper to set up the 5 stories, including the clues, available keeper actions, monsters, and objectives that are to be used in that specific story. Speaking of objectives, each of the game's 5 stories has 3 unique objective cards associated to them. which lists the winning conditions for both the keeper and the investigators. The keeper will receive one of these 3 cards at the start of the game based upon the choices he made within the keeper guide. However, because these cards are hidden from the investigators at the start of the game, investigators must search for the clues within the mansion in order to reveal their ultimate goal. Each story also has a unique deck of 5 event cards that represent the occurrences that unfold as the story progresses, regardless of the actions taken by either the investigators or the keeper himself. Each of the event cards is drawn after a set number of turns and lists up to 3 possible or different effects that will take place at that given time. Again, the action on the card that will take place is based solely upon the choices made by the keeper at the start of the game. Think of event cards as unavoidable story-based events that happen at specific times no matter what you do in the game. Next are the 13 keeper action cards. Specific keeper action cards are only made available to the keeper and are listed within the keeper guide for each of the game's stories. The total number of cards and choices will vary drastically depending upon which of the 5 stories that are used, but they most typically provide the keeper with a basic set of actions that can be performed on their turn by spending any of his available threat tokens. Threat tokens represent the growing strength of the keeper and are accumulated each round in accordance to the number of investigator players participating. The more players, the more threat tokens the keeper will gain and be able to spend on his turn. As previously mentioned, threat tokens can be spent to perform several of the keeper's available actions, as well as to play Mythos cards. The 35 Mythos cards are the supernatural or unexpected events that the keeper can play on the investigators during their turns, usually slowing them down or inflicting damage or horror to the investigators directly. These too require an expenditure of threat tokens from the keeper's available pool, and similar to most of the other decks in the game, the Mythos deck is constructed prior to the start of the game in accordance to the keeper's guide. Each of the Mythos cards has an icon at the bottom of the card which will denote which set of cards will be used in that specific story. However, there is a random element within the available cards inside this pre-constructed deck, since all the available cards will be shuffled together randomly. Similar to the Mythos cards are trauma cards, which represent the physical and emotional damage that the keeper can inflict upon the investigators. These cards, however, differ from the Mythos cards in that they can only be played immediately after an investigator takes damage or horror on his sanity. Once a trauma card is received, it becomes very difficult for the players to rid himself of the affliction. And as investigators take more damage and more horror throughout the game, they become more and more susceptible to the effects of stronger trauma cards, which brings me to the damage and horror tokens themselves. These tokens are placed upon the investigator's character cards and are used to track how much damage or horror has been dealt to each specific character. Players can be driven insane or even permanently killed in Mansions of Madness, so it's imperative that players monitor their conditions and work as a team at all times in order to survive. Although combat is not the main focus of Mansions of Madness, investigators will often encounter situations where they must fight against corrupt humans and nightmarish creatures in the game. Combat is determined through the use of combat cards, both for the investigator and monster attacks. Combat cards come in 3 types matching the 3 classes of monsters in the game, which are humanoid, beasts, and eldritch. Each combat card lists the mechanical outcome of the fight for both the investigators as well as the monster involved. All monster tokens and figures in the game are categorized into one of these 3 classes based upon their physical appearance and abilities within the game. We'll start off by looking at the figures and their bases. Each figure attaches to a specific base according to the size of the monster. This is done simply enough by gently pushing the monster's figure and peg into the pre-cut holes within the base. Players may of course choose to glue their figures down completely, which would alleviate them separating from their bases. However, if you're the type of gamer who enjoys painting your miniatures, then it might be best to do that after deciding to glue them into place. The bases also have a slit on their sides for the monster's corresponding monster token to slide into, which lists the creature's awareness as well as their horror rating on their front sides. The back of each token lists the monster's unique special attack, health, and damage values. What's great about these monster tokens, though, is that each identical monster in the game has a different backside to them, which create variety and a sense of randomness within the game structure, and their bottom sides are kept completely secret from the investigators until they are able to damage that specific monster directly.